You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 460 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about how the Afghanistan peace deal that was just signed between the U.S. and the Taliban is already faltering. And I'm going to update what's going on in Syria, where U.S. NATO ally Turkey is now in direct conflict with the Syrian government backed by Russia. Important stuff to cover on today's show, so make sure you share it. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor. I write the daily news roundup. The roundup and the show are both featured on the homepage at libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. You can find the show everywhere in its own podcast feed. It's also on the Libertarian Institute podcast feed, where you get my show, Scott Horton, Free Man Beyond the Wall, and so many other great podcasts. Last, you could donate to the show over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I want to mention on today's show is kind of an interesting political phenomenon in the U.S. that I think is worth noting, and that is attending the AIPAC conference and giving a speech in support of Israel isn't necessarily a part of the coronation to be the Democratic nominee for president. We see this as Bernie Sanders is not attending this year, and at this point, I think it's fair to say that he's the clear frontrunner. There is certainly an attempt by the more establishment candidates to try to all now coalesce around Joe Biden, and Bloomberg still doing something in the race. Both Biden, who submitted a video, and Mike Bloomberg actually attended the AIPAC conference, which is the American Israel Political Action Committee, and is very supportive and promotes Israeli interest in the U.S. The reason this is important is because the U.S. and Israel both maintain a fairly hawkish position when it comes to the Middle East, whether it's attempts to overthrow dictators, create instability, oppress and steal land from the Palestinians. It's supported by both governments here. And if the less influence the Israel lobby has, I think that's an indication that Americans are probably less interested in foreign interventionism, especially the kind of foreign interventionism that Israel is interested in, like wars in the Middle East. I am recording this on Super Tuesday. I haven't done, a very political show in a while. I had Joanne Leone on a couple times in the past to talk about the DNC race. Purely from a libertarian perspective, I don't think there's necessarily a clear preference between Bernie and Biden. I think, there's a lot of problems with both candidates. Maybe Bernie's a little less hawkish, but, single payer healthcare is horrific. So I'm interested to see how this race moves, ahead going forward, and if they'll ever start talking about foreign policy and the differences between the candidates there, and not just how much free healthcare are you going to in college are you going to give me. So on the last show with Will Porter, he discussed how the U.S. changed the way it looks at Chinese-owned state media in the U.S. And something interesting that has now come about is that the U.S. is going to look to reduce the number of employees, I'm assuming they're Chinese nationals, that are working for them in their U.S. agency. I guess the U.S. will be able to do this because it's labeled these media agencies as foreign ministries, and so then maybe it's like it's spelling ambassador. I assume that's kind of the legal route they're going to take. And so this is kind of just like what me and Will talked about in the last show, is that these things always expand, and they become more aggressive and more of a tool for the interventionist. All right, Trump says he wants to hold arms control talks with the UN Security Council members, who are all nuclear armed states, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China. And while this, in most cases would be something that I'm 100% ready to celebrate, and even now I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but the fear is that Trump is trying to negotiate something to replace the New START treaty. And at this point, the treaty has less than a year before it expires. And so there's not time to negotiate something new. And I'm not sure, maybe if it's Hotz and his administration who want the New START treaty to expire, telling him that he needs to include China in any kind of arms control talks and not to do something bilateral with Russia. Or if that's, just Mr. Art of the deal, I could get the greatest thing done ever. But, it's a mistake not to take the first step by extending the New START treaty. It could be done, in 5 years, no problem. And that the Trump the Trump administration isn't looking to take that step first is concerning. Ukraine and Russia are looking to swap some more prisoners. Now, when I talked about it on the show around the new year when they engaged in a prisoner swap, I had thought that most prisoners at that time were swapped. And so I'm not sure if more people were taken captive or if maybe they're expanding the definition of, who was a prisoner taken by war. I imagine that since this is a civil war, there were a lot of people that were maybe captured and labeled as POWs or, put in military prisons or something like that, when in reality it was just political captives. And so maybe looking to get some of those people released. I will bring you more details if I get them, but it's great to see these two sides talking and us moving away from, these tensions in the Ukrainian civil war. North Korea fired 2 short-range missiles. No reason or cause for concern here. I think the, media and most everybody is just too tied up in the coronavirus hysteria and a lot of other things going on in the world right now to try to make too much out of this missile test. But it doesn't seem like there's any reason that this should impact U.S. negotiations with North Korea or cause the U.S. to think that North Korea isn't willing to scale down tensions with the U.S. still. All right, so the Afghan peace talks, one of the points of the deal that me and Will had talked about on the last show, that's Will Porter, who's a staff writer over at RT, was that the peace deal called for the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners and the Taliban to release 1,000 prisoners, and that the Afghan government had said they're already not going to participate in this. As far as I could tell from the deal that's been made public, kind of the next step of the deal. And so at least the Taliban interpretation is that the Afghan government isn't going to release the prisoners, then they're not going to hold talks about anything but the prisoner exchange. Interesting today that we find out, a great piece by Reuters, and I'll put this one in the show notes page, that the U.S. had language difference between the copy of the peace deal they gave the Taliban versus the Afghan government. Now, the Afghan government isn't a signatory here, so I guess the problem is that the official thing that was signed with the Taliban pretty explicitly says this prisoner swap will happen. And the problem for the Afghan government is that they, really didn't agree to what the U.S. said they were agreeing. And so this has resulted in the Taliban, I guess, officially taking away whatever defensive posture that they had assumed. And they carried out at least one attack at a Afghan government checkpoint, killing 5 police. Another thing I had talked about on the last show is the possibility of secret annexes within the agreement. And we got confirmation from Mike Pompeo that there are at least 2 of them, although he's not going to tell us what they are. Likely, in the reporting around it has been that these secret annexes include ways to keep U.S. what they're going to label as counterterrorism and forces in Afghanistan long term. And, the reports have ranged from a few hundred forces up to, I believe, just the 8,600 number. So the U.S. could maintain a lot of forces in Afghanistan, even if the deal is carried out in full. Now, my concern and what me and Will talked about in the last show was that the deal would essentially fall apart as soon as there's any violence in Afghanistan. Hawks in America will capitalize and say, oh, we can't follow through with it now. And then we'll delay our commitments in the deal. And so then the Taliban will increase in tats. And, that cycle will continue. And so, we're possibly already seeing the first kind of, segments of this cycle. And it is concerning that this peace deal could fall apart very quickly. One narrative that I want to get out in front of, because I'm sure we're going to see it from Hawks somewhere, is that, oh, look, the Taliban sign a peace deal and then immediately start violating it. When that's not really the case here, as it was, the U.S. that misled the Taliban and the Afghan government as to what the agreement was, and that causes tensions that, cause a return to violence. Is it, important to mention here that the Taliban really have engaged in any direct talks with the Afghan government. That is something that's supposed to come according to the peace deal. But, as I said, the Afghan government wasn't a signatory to this peace deal and really condemned the negotiations going on the whole time. I don't think there's any reason to expect that they would want this deal to succeed. I think they see more success having more U.S. forces in the country. Trump did hold a phone call with the top Taliban negotiator. Not sure how that went. Heard it lasted a half hour. But as always, I'm always in favor of diplomacy and talking. Some news from around the Middle East. Netanyahu claims victory in Israel's election. It's unclear if he's going to have a majority coalition, people, to elect him to be president, but it does seem that his Likud party will end up with the most seats in the Knesset, which means he will get first crack at forming a government. From my understanding, the Arab parties did fairly well, possibly securing 15 seats. The IAEA, I believe, has actually issued now a rebuke of Iran as far as the Iran nuclear deal goes and their official capacity in inspecting and ensuring Iran's commitment to the deal. This is all around a facility that the Israelis, I believe in 2018, claimed was a secret nuclear facility. The IAEA inspected the site at least once in 2019, and I believe just wants to do further inspection. As Jason Ditz at Anti-War points out, the problem for the Iranians is that it's a damned if you do, you're a damned if you don't. You allow the inspections to happen, they find nothing, and then everybody just talks about how good the Iranians are at getting away with things. And then you also allow, probably a violation of your sovereignty and set a bad precedent. So there's a really good recent episode of the Scott Horton Show with Nasser Arabi, who has done an excellent job of reporting on the war in Yemen from Yemen. And Scott's been interviewing him for, 5 years or so now about it. And one of the things he pointed out on the show recently was that pretty much everything coming into Yemen is coming into the port of Hodeidah, because the port in Aden, which is the new capital city of Yemen, as recognized by the government of Saudi Arabia and their puppet government in Yemen. So it seems like this should be the most secure port, but Nasser is saying that nobody uses it because of the insecurity and the problems with it. And then the next day I saw this story saying that Southern separatists had actually stormed the port, and these are a group of people who live in the area of Yemen controlled by the Saudi-backed government, but who oppose that government, at least at times, and they were able to prevent a cargo ship from offloading diesel. Unfortunately, fighting has increased in the areas around Hodeidah recently, and so while it is maybe the most important port in Yemen right now, it could very easily be shut down because of the war going on and cutting an important humanitarian lifeline to the Yemeni people. All right, so talking about the Idlib Province of Syria now, and this is the last remaining of the al-Qaeda Syrian rebels with the backing of Turkey are holding out against the Syrian government backed by primarily Russia, but there's also Hezbollah and I assume Iranian forces fighting in the area. Erdogan has stated several times that he will take an aggressive incursion into Syria to prevent the fall of, the last of the Syrian rebels. And again, these are guys who were a break-off from al-Qaeda in Iraq. When that became ISIS, they became the al-Nusra Front, led by the same guy, al-Jolani. And while they've changed their name several times, and now I believe landing on HTS, nonetheless, these are guys who swore loyalty oaths to Osama bin Laden, and they're now being backed by Turkey. And, the U.S. had long backed these, what they called at the time moderate rebels as well. Now, Erdogan, Turkey's president, is scheduled to fly to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The, I guess, good thing about this meeting is it signals we're probably not all that close to the World War III scenario breaking out, where the U.S. goes to war with Turkey against Syria and Russia, as the two sides here are still being able to talk and trying to work out a ceasefire. The problem is I think Turkey's demands are unrealistic in the kind of the situation going on in Syria. I don't think Assad is just going to concede that this area is going to be controlled by HTS and its al-Qaeda forces, and will likely continue to wage this front. And Russia, in their position, I think will continue to back the Syrian government. And this means For Turkey, unfortunately, they can't do anything about it. Eventually, this area will be retaken by Syria. I guess it's just maybe how much damage Erdogan can inflict on the Syrian army in the process. Turkish soldiers continue to die in this offensive. At least 4, I believe, have been killed in the past 5 or 6 days, with some reports of more soldiers, I believe up to 16 dying before that. So this isn't a completely costless incursion for Turkey. And you had to think Erdogan, with the economic troubles he has at home, would be interested in kind of protecting some of his country's wealth. Turkey says it shot down another Syrian plane. I believe this would be the total of 3. And then we had U.S., I believe he's a special envoy to the Middle East, James Jeffrey. I've talked about him on the past on the show. He's a hawk in the administration, advocating for Syrian regime change. He says that the U.S. is going to provide humanitarian assistance and ammunition to Turkey as they continue to fight within Syria. Elsewhere in Syria, Israel took another shot. This was before the election, so who knows if this was in part because the election was coming up. But apparently hit a drone on some kind of vehicle. Now, Israel claims they were firing sniper shots into Israeli territory. But, Israel usually claims something like that. And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. All right, on to Iraq, where there's a quite interesting situation with the government right now. Iraq's new prime minister, this is a guy that was elected by the parliament there after the previous prime minister resigned and assumed a caretaker's role. Probably gonna pronounce his name wrong, but it's al-Awali. He quit after the parliament didn't vote for the government. So this is like one of those systems where you're the prime minister and then you pick your cabinet and then you go before the parliament and try to get your cabinet approved. Well, they wouldn't approve his cabinet. So after a couple rounds of this, he ends up quitting. And on the same day that he quit, the previous prime minister, Mahdi, quit his caretaker's role. And so I'm not quite sure what's going on within the government of Iraq, but it's political instability, and in a time and a place where political instability is, very concerning. There, still protests going on in Iraq. Iraqi security forces killed a protester. Coronavirus has infected a couple people in Iraq, and I'm sure that's going to be an issue. At least putting, additional strain on a system in Iraq that is already very, people even in oil-rich regions of Iraq don't have, good water, sewage, electricity. Imagine the coronavirus in that environment. And then, of course, with the tensions between the U.S., Saudi Arabia, UAE, and then Iran, and some of that battlefield has, been playing out, like the Soleimani assassination in Iraq. I believe this was on Sunday, so the day before the prime minister and then the caretaker prime minister resigned. 2 rockets landed in Baghdad's green zone, one near the U.S. embassy, but it didn't hit it. All right, there's some stories here from Africa that I want to talk about. The UN envoy to Libya has resigned. He cited that the stress from the job was harming his health. I don't blame the guy. It's an awfully stressful situation going on in Libya, where you have all these international, governments and consensus saying we're not going to, provide arms to the warring party in Libya, and then, they all go ahead and do it anyway. The Somali government is now clashing with a Sufi militant group. This is a group that in the past has fought alongside the Somali government against the forces of al-Shabaab, but apparently the Somali government attacked this militia, and that's how the fighting broke out. At least 50 people were killed by an armed gang in Nigeria, and then the U.S. plans to give $389 million to Zambia for AIDS relief. This is something that isn't probably the worst action of the U.S. government and the State Department and our foreign, interventionism abroad. But, time and time again, it's been shown that this aid actually doesn't help people. It just further corrupts the government. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap it up today. Hope you're enjoying the show. Share it at the Libertarian Institute. Find my news roundup there at KYAAALE on Twitter. Patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. Of course, check out antiwar.com, where I'm the assistant editor. And thanks for tuning in.